900 years ago, a man sat down and wrote a sentence that shouldn't have been possible yet. He wrote that the earth pulls things toward itself. Not the heavens pulling you up, not God's deciding when an apple falls, the earth itself reaching out, dragging every object back to its surface. He wrote this 5 centuries before Isaac Newton ever watched a piece of fruit hit the ground. So, who was he? And why isn't his name the one you learned in school? You know the Newton story by heart. Apple falls, genius strikes, gravity is born, 1687, done. It's clean, it's simple, it's also not the whole picture. And the missing part changes how you think about where ideas actually come from. Here's why that matters to you right now, today, not just as trivia. Every time you drop your phone and it hits the floor instead of drifting sideways, you're trusting a force you've never once questioned. You call it gravity and move on with your day. But somebody somewhere had to notice it first, had to sit with the strangeness of it. Why does everything fall the same direction? Why doesn't a stone just float where you let it go? Long before there was a word for the answer, somebody had to fill the question. That person's name was Bhaskara II, an astronomer and mathematician working in 12th century India in a region now part of Karnataka. Around 1150 CE, he finished a massive astronomical work called the Siddha Antashirmani, crown of treatises. Buried inside its chapter on celestial spheres, the gold daya sits a single verse that describes the earth as having a force. Gurtivaikara. Roughly translated, the pull of a heavy body. He wasn't describing the sky pulling you up. He wasn't describing divine will. He was describing the planet physically, actively pulling. Picture this. You're standing under a night sky with no telescopes, no satellites, no equations for acceleration, no falling body experiments dropped off towers. Everything you know about the heavens comes from watching them move for years, decades, generations of careful record keeping passed down teacher to student. And from that, using nothing but patient observation and mathematics, someone reasons their way to this. Massive bodies attract other bodies. That's not a myth. That's not folklore dressed up as science to make an old book sound impressive. Historian of mathematics Kim Plofker, who has spent her career studying Indian astronomical texts, documents this verse directly in her research on the history of Indian mathematics. And she's direct about the timeline. Bhaskara's description of an attractive force predates Newton's published law by roughly 500 years. So why have you never heard his name? Picture him for a second. Not a mystic in a cave. A working mathematician sitting with palm leaf manuscripts crossed, checking planetary tables against decades of recorded sky positions, because a single error would throw off calendars used across the region. This is the same mind that, in another chapter of the same book, worked out early rules resembling calculus, rates of change in planetary motion. 500 years before that math had a name in Europe, the gravity verse wasn't a lucky guess dropped into a religious poem. It was one working conclusion inside a career built on precise, checkable astronomy. Here's where it gets strange. Bhaskara wasn't working in isolation, and he wasn't the only ancient mind circling this exact question. Rewind another century. In the Islamic Golden Age, the scholar Al-Bardan, writing around 1030 CE, a full century before Bhaskara, calculated the Earth's radius with startling accuracy using nothing but a mountain, a horizon angle, and trigonometry. And once he had the size of the Earth in his hands, he started asking the obvious next question. Why does everything fall toward its center instead of flying outward or drifting off into space? He never fully answered it, but he asked it on record 100 years before Bhaskara's verse and 500 years before Newton's apple. Keep going further back. Greek philosophers, centuries earlier still, wondered why heavy objects seem to seek the center of the earth as if pulled home by something they belong to. Historian of science George Gevorgis Joseph, in his book The Crest of the Peacock, traces how these threads of inquiry ran in parallel across civilizations that had little to no contact with each other. Different languages, different gods, different number systems entirely. The same question asked over and over in isolation without anyone copying anyone. Why does everything fall down and not sideways or up? Go further east and the pattern holds. Chinese astronomers, as early as the 2nd century CE, were building instruments to track celestial motion with a precision that assumed the Earth was a fixed, solid body things naturally returned to. The scholar Zhang Heng designed a seismoscope and an armillary sphere on exactly that assumption without ever writing a law of anything. He didn't need the word gravity to build machines that behaved as if he understood it. That's the part that should stop you. It wasn't one genius who cracked a locked door no one else could even find. It was dozens of thinkers, centuries apart, on different continents, arriving at fragments of the same idea, because the evidence was sitting right there in front of every single human being who ever dropped a stone and watched it land. Stop for a second and count them. A Greek philosopher, a Chinese astronomer, a Central Asian scholar measuring mountains, an Indian mathematician writing verse, 4 civilizations, 3 continents, 0 contact with each other's texts, and the same invisible force kept showing up in every single one of their notebooks uninvited. Now here's the twist, and it's the uncomfortable one. Bhaskara did not discover gravity the way Newton did. Say that part clearly, because it matters. He didn't derive an inverse square law. He didn't have the mathematics to predict how fast an object accelerates or to show why the moon doesn't simply fall out of the sky and crash into you. What he had was an intuition, phrased in poetic Sanskrit verse, that something invisible was pulling things toward the earth. And he was right about that much, 5 centuries before anyone could prove it with numbers. Newton's real contribution wasn't noticing that things fall. Everyone since the first human being ever dropped a rock noticed that things fall. Newton's contribution was mathematics precise enough to predict exactly how they fall and to show that the same force holding you to the ground also holds the moon locked in its orbit around the earth and the earth locked in its orbit around the sun. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between a guess that happens to be true and a law you can build a rocket with. So the real question was never who thought of gravity first. Every civilization thought of gravity first in its own way because gravity doesn't hide from anyone paying attention. The real question is why we only ever tell one version of that story. And that's where the stakes get bigger than one verse in one old book. Because this isn't really about gravity at all. It's about how history decides whose thinking counts as science and whose thinking gets fired away as mysticism. Bhaskara's verse sat inside an astronomical treatise that also calculated planetary positions with genuine mathematical rigor. The same document contains early mathematical ideas that resemble differential calculus, worked out centuries before Leibniz and Newton formalized calculus in Europe. Plocker's research is direct on this point. The mathematical sophistication was already there on the page in 1150. But because it was written in Sanskrit verse, embedded in a cosmological framework unfamiliar to later European scholars translating it centuries afterward, it got read as poetry instead of physics. The idea wasn't wrong. The container it arrived in just didn't look like a laboratory to the people deciding what counted as one. There's actually a name for this pattern, and it's not just about ancient astronomy. Sociologist Robert K. Merton studied how credit gets distributed in science and noticed the same thing happening over and over in every field. In every era, the person who finally proves an idea gets the credit, while everyone who noticed it earlier, without the proof, quietly disappears from the story. He called it the Matthew effect, named after the biblical line about the rich getting richer. In science, fame gets richer the same way. Newton didn't need to hide Bhaskara's verse or erase Al-Birbi's question. He didn't even need to know about them. The system does the erasing on its own, automatically, every time a later proof outshines an earlier intuition. Think about what that means for anything you've ever been taught to trust as the origin of an idea. The first sketch and the final proof rarely belong to the same person, the same country, or even the same century. Somebody notices, somebody else measures. Somebody after that finally writes the equation that makes the whole thing undeniable. And it's usually that last person's name that survives. Not because the earlier ones were wrong, because their version arrived without the proof attached, and proof is what gets remembered. You do this too on a much smaller scale. more often than you'd guess, you notice something true about your own life long before you have the language or the evidence to explain it. A pattern, a feeling, a hunch that something's off, weeks before you can point to why. And because you can't prove it yet, you often talk yourself out of it. You wait for someone with credentials to say it first, so it finally counts, so it's allowed to be true. Bhaskara's verse is a 900-year-old reminder that being early and being unproven isn't the same thing as being wrong. So tonight, when you drop something and catch it, or watch it hit the floor without a second thought, you're standing at the end of a very long relay race. A 12th century astronomer in Karnataka wrote it down first in verse without ever seeing it proven. An 11th century scholar in Central Asia measured the size of the planet doing the polling and asked the question out loud a century before that. Greek philosophers, further back still, sensed that heavy things belonged to the ground and wanted to return to it. And a 17th century Englishman finally turned the whole scattered intuition into a law precise enough to send something into space. None of them got there alone, and none of them got there first in the way the story usually gets told. The earth was always pulling. The only thing that changed, century after century, culture after culture, was who finally had the proof and whose name got remembered for having it.